Hello, and welcome to today's episode of In the Moment. I'm your host, Michael Clark, certified life coach, former therapist, and owner of Clark Coaching Services. I was a therapist for 8 years of my career and have been a life coach for almost 2 years now. And I just want to give back and share my knowledge and experience with you to try to help navigate this thing we call life. Thank you in advance for listening, and I'm so glad you're here. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I want to talk about something that I think happens far more often than people realize. And once you start noticing it, you hear it everywhere. Somebody starts crying and immediately says, "I'm sorry." Someone gets emotional while talking about something painful and says, "Sorry, I don't know why I'm crying." Someone opens up about being overwhelmed and then follows it with, "I'm sorry for dumping this on you." And I started really thinking about this recently because I've noticed how many people apologize simply for being human, not for hurting someone, not for being cruel, not for doing something wrong, but for feeling, for crying, for grieving, for being overwhelmed, for struggling, for needing support, for not holding everything together perfectly. And I think a lot of people listening to this probably do it too without even realizing it. You start tearing up and suddenly you feel guilty for it, like your emotions became an inconvenience the moment another person witnessed them. And honestly, I think there are a lot of reasons this happens. Some of them come from childhood, some from relationships, some from culture, some from survival, some from trauma, some from just exhaustion, and some from years and years of emotional conditioning. But I think one of the biggest reasons is this. A lot of us grew up learning that happiness was acceptable, excitement was acceptable, being easygoing was acceptable, but sadness? Oh no. Crying? No. Fear? Absolutely not. Overwhelm? Nope. Neediness? Oh, that's horrible. Those emotions often got treated very differently. Some people were told directly, "Stop crying. You're too sensitive. You're being dramatic. Calm down. Be strong." And even if those exact words weren't said, sometimes people learned emotionally that vulnerability made other people uncomfortable. So eventually, they learned to apologize for it. I remember talking with someone once who had been carrying so much emotional pressure for such a long time. She had responsibilities pulling her in every direction: work stress, family stress, relationship stress, constant pressure to keep showing up for everyone else while quietly feeling like her own needs kept getting pushed further and further down the list. And while she was talking, you could tell she was trying so hard to hold it together, trying not to cry, trying not to, quote unquote, lose control. And eventually the tears came out anyway. And the very first thing she said was, "I'm sorry." Not because she had done something wrong, but because somewhere along the way, she learned that showing pain in front of someone else required an apology. And honestly, I think a lot of people listening understand that feeling, especially women, because women are often placed in this impossible emotional position where they are expected to emotionally support everyone else while simultaneously feeling pressure not to become too emotional themselves, whatever too emotional means. And those mixed messages create a lot of internal conflict. You're allowed to care for everyone else. You're allowed to absorb stress. You're allowed to nurture. You're allowed to listen. But the moment your emotions become visible, now you feel shame. And that shame can show up in really quiet ways. like minimizing your pain, laughing while talking about something heartbreaking, changing the subject, saying things like, it's not a big deal, or I'm fine, or other people have it worse, or apologizing for crying. That one gets me every time. And I think another major reason people apologize for emotions is because they don't want to feel like a burden. People are terrified that their sadness will weigh somebody else down, especially people who are used to being the strong one, the dependable one, the helper, the caretaker, the one everybody leans on. Because when your identity becomes wrapped up in being emotionally strong for everyone else, it can feel incredibly uncomfortable to suddenly become the person who needs support. I remember hearing about someone who was going through a really painful family situation around Mother's Day. There was grief involved, loss, estrangement, a lot of complicated emotions layered together. And she spent hours crying, but also apologizing repeatedly while doing it. Apologizing because she felt like she was ruining the day, ruining the mood, being quote unquote too much. And that hit me deeply because grief is already painful enough by itself. But now imagine grieving while simultaneously feeling guilty for grieving. That's emotional exhaustion on top of emotional pain. And I think so many people carry that combination, not just sadness, but guilt about the sadness. And honestly, that guilt often comes from years of emotional conditioning. Maybe growing up in a household where emotions weren't talked about. Maybe having parents who dismissed feelings. Maybe being in relationships where vulnerability was criticized. Maybe learning early that emotional expression led to rejection, discomfort, punishment, or abandonment. So eventually, people adapt. They become emotionally careful. They start believing, I need to manage my emotions alone. I should not need anybody. I have to stay strong. I cannot fall apart. And while resilience is important, hyper independence is not always strength. Sometimes hyper independence is unhealed survival. Sometimes people isolate emotionally because asking for support feels unsafe. And I talked about this before in an earlier episode when I said that asking for help is not weakness. It actually takes a tremendous amount of courage to allow another human being to see you honestly. That is vulnerability. And vulnerability is uncomfortable, partly because we cannot fully control how another person responds to it. Some people were vulnerable before and got hurt for it. So now they apologize in advance for their emotions, almost like emotional self protection. Like, if I apologize first, maybe I'll soften the inconvenience of my feelings. But emotions are not moral failures. Sadness is not weakness. Grief is not weakness. Fear is not weakness. Overwhelm is not weakness. They are human experiences. Now, another thing I think we really need to talk about is embarrassment. A lot of people feel embarrassed when emotions become visible, especially crying. And I think part of that comes from the fact that crying physically exposes emotion in a way that's difficult to hide. Your voice changes, your breathing changes, your face changes, and you lose some control over how composed you appear. And in a world where so many people are trying desperately to appear fine all the time, That loss of control can feel terrifying. I also think social media has intensified this problem because now people constantly see curated versions of strength, success, beauty, productivity, and emotional composure. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, people are exhausted, burnt out, lonely, heartbroken, confused, emotionally overwhelmed. But many still feel pressure to perform emotional stability instead of actually experiencing it honestly. And that pressure creates shame around normal emotional experiences. Another thing that's important to mention here is hormones and biology. Because, yes, hormones absolutely can influence emotional intensity and emotional regulation. I want to talk about this carefully because I never want emotions dismissed as just hormones. But biologically speaking, hormones do affect the nervous system, mood regulation, stress response, and emotional sensitivity. Things like chronic stress, elevated cortisol, sleep deprivation, PMS, PMDD, perimenopause, postpartum anxiety, and emotional burnout can absolutely make emotions feel much closer to the surface. And honestly, that matters because sometimes people judge themselves harshly for being emotional without realizing their nervous system is just overloaded. Their body is exhausted, their stress levels are elevated, their emotional reserves are depleted. And what happens? The smallest thing suddenly causes tears, not because they're weak, but because they've been carrying too much for too long. And here's something interesting. People rarely apologize for laughing. Nobody bursts into laughter and says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for laughing." But sadness, people apologize for that constantly. Why? Because culturally, joy is often viewed as socially acceptable and emotionally easy for others to absorb. Sadness feels heavier. And many people fear their sadness will create discomfort in other people. But discomfort is not the same thing as burden. That distinction matters. Sometimes being emotionally honest creates discomfort because it's real, not because it's wrong. And honestly, some of the deepest human connection happens in emotionally honest moments, not in perfection, not in performance, not in pretending, but in truth. I also think there's another layer here. Many people generally don't know what healthy emotional support even looks like because they've rarely experienced it. Healthy emotional support is not fixing everything, having perfect advice, saying the perfect words. Sometimes support is simply, "I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone. You don't need to apologize for feeling this." And that's it. Listening matters. Presence matters. Emotional safety matters. And I think one of the healthiest things people can start practicing is separating emotion from shame. You can feel deeply without believing something is wrong with you. You can cry without believing you failed. You can need support without believing you're weak. You can struggle without believing you're broken. And for the people listening who constantly apologize for emotions, I want you to try to gently start noticing when you do it, not judging yourself for it, just noticing. Notice how automatic it might be. You start crying and your brain immediately says, "Sorry." Ask yourself, Why am I apologizing right now? Did I hurt someone? Or did I simply become emotionally visible? Because those are two very different things. And if your emotional visibility has always felt unsafe, that awareness alone can become an important step toward healing. I also think it helps to start challenging the belief that strength means emotional isolation. Real strength is not pretending you never struggle. Real strength is honesty, self awareness, emotional courage, allowing yourself to be human, and maybe most importantly, allowing yourself to be supported sometimes too. Because carrying everything alone may feel familiar, but familiar is not always healthy. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can say is, I'm not okay right now. And sometimes healing begins the moment somebody finally stops apologizing for that. So, if you're somebody who has spent years minimizing your emotions, holding back tears, trying not to burden others, trying to stay strong for everyone else, I really want you to hear this today. Your emotions are not an inconvenience. Your sadness does not make you weak. Your vulnerability does not make you broken. And needing support does not make you less valuable. It makes you human. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. And if this episode resonated with you, I hope you share it with someone who may need the reminder that they do not have to apologize for being human. And as always, take care of yourself.